So what about biochemistry? We mentioned lactate a moment ago, but if we look at maximal blood lactate concentration, well, it's limited in children compared to adults. Well, that's primarily because of the particularly in children, they have those reduced concentrations of testosterone. That certainly would kind of support what is going on. But there's some evidence to show that the lower maximal blood lactate concentration in children may be the result of faster lactate removal and not necessarily because of lower lactate production. So this is quite interesting, that there is some tentative evidence to suggest that actually, if lactate is our indicator of glycolysis, that the rate at which glycolysis is operating is probably the same. It's probably the same in children as in adults, but their ability to clear lactate is far more efficient than it is in adults. So we have to think about, well, why is that the case? Well, of course, it's fundamentally linked to muscle fiber typing. Which fiber types are more proficient at removing lactate? It's slow twitch fibers. And so what we start to understand is that in children, they have a more slow twitch fiber orientated capacity. It's only as they start to develop does fast twitch fiber capabilities start to accelerate. So they've got more slow twitch fibers proportionally, and therefore a greater fiber network for clearing lactate. It's also tied with that, we have to think about enzyme activity, things like phosphorylase, pyruvate dehydrogenase, and things like phosphofructokinase. And they are less active in muscle cells of 11 to say 13-year-old boys than they are compared to 16 to 17-year-old boys, again, compared to in adults. Again, indicating PFK is an indication of glycolysis. So it may well be that glycolysis is slowed down. Why? Because we talked about testosterone being reduced. Testosterone is linked to lactate. Lactate is your indicator of glycolysis. Pyruvate dehydrogenase, again, is the primary enzyme that is used in converting lactate to pyruvate and pyruvate to lactate. And so, again, it kind of helps us understand a little bit about the rates of lactate production that we're looking at in children compared to adults. And if we just look at this in terms of, well, okay, what do we know in terms of maximal muscle lactate? I'm always dubious about maximal muscle lactate or any peak lactate concentration because it has so much kind of variability in its data, but it's quite useful, I suppose, to help us that it kind of conforms. That the maximal concentration increases with age. Again, seems to conform to what we looked at with testosterone. So if we just flick back very quickly, look at the testosterone concentration accelerating. It starts to slow down a little bit, but it's still rising over that period of time. But it's also, because it's the maximal muscle lactate concentration, this is kind of an indication of what is being produced. So it's a reflection of glycolysis. Don't confuse it with blood lactate. Because remember that in blood lactate, that is a reflection of the appearance and disappearance of lactate. So this really does reflect for us what is going on glycolytically, and that there is a suppression in substrate level glycolysis compared to adolescence and compared to adulthood. And then what does this compare in terms of if we look at the absolute substrate? Well, the concentrations for ATP, millimoles per kilogram, is when compared, it's the same as when compared to adults. Remember that the total amount of muscle mass is reduced. Therefore, when we uniformly refer to having about 85 grams of ATP in stored muscle, that's in adults. The total amount in a child is going to be significantly reduced, but the millimoles per kilogram of muscle mass is identical. Their utilization rate, again, for ATP is the same. But when you get to something like PCR concentration, significantly lower compared to adults, but the rate of utilization is the same. The rate of utilization is enzymatically generated, so it indicates actually that in children they have an abundance of the enzyme which is creatine phosphate kinase, compared to adults. But why is this lower and why is glycogen concentration lower? Well, fundamentally, because they're both stored in muscle. And if the muscle tissue area is lower, then there will also be a significant reduction in the amount of stored substrate that is actually going to be available for energy expenditure.